Doge is absolutely the most impressive operation, I think, that I've ever seen inside of any government organisation. We need something similar here, don't we?
When you see what they're doing in America, do you get the feeling we ought to be doing it here?
Lately, there's been this growing idea that the government is too big and too restrictive.
How much do you think we can rip out of this wasted $6.5 trillion Harris-Biden budget?
Well, I think we could do at least $2 trillion.
Yeah!
And there's no clearer example of this than Elon Musk's Doge department, leading to a revolution of sorts, with dudes with bad haircuts holding chainsaws coming to free the handcuffs of government bureaucracy from the people. However, is this concept really new? Has it been tried before? Well, my friends, today I will tell you the story of Britain's failed Doge department.
We should always fix the roof while the sun is shining.
Right, so it was the 2nd of August, 2024. Elon Musk appeared on Lex Fridman's podcast. And in this podcast, he discussed the idea of a brand new department in the United States government.
I have discussed with Trump the idea of a government efficiency commission.
Nice. Yeah.
And I would be willing to be part of that commission.
Little did we know that this small, off-the-cuff mention would evolve into Elon Musk jumping around on a stage with a fucking chainsaw, celebrating the Department of Governmental Efficiency.
We have very smart people going in, so I've instructed him go into education, go into military, go into other things as we go along. And they're finding massive amounts of fraud, abuse, waste.
So what's going on here? Why is all this fucking commotion about bureaucracy? Where did it come from? Well, mainly, it comes down to this graph right here. This is America's debt. If we look at 2020, we'll see that America's debt exceeded its GDP. The American people looked around and went, shit boys, we're in a lot of debt. How do we fix this? So the kind of thing that was being sold is that the richest man on earth would come in and save America from what was clearly incompetent bureaucrats who must just be spaffing the money up the walls on transsexual book clubs and condoms for Gaza.
I will restore the working man to his rightful glory. I will dismantle this oppressive establishment board by board.
You see, my friends, behind all of this rhetoric and storytelling of evil bureaucrats and heroic billionaires, at the heart of what Doge is public spending cuts. That's what it is. Just, with a fresh lick of paint, it's cuts.
Elon canceled millions and millions in contracts that go to disabled veterans who own small businesses. They cut off the suicide hotline for veterans.
Now you see here, 4,520 miles away, we here in Britain know a little something about cuts. Because not all that long ago, we were sold the exact same premise, but instead of a billionaire with a chainsaw, we got a boring bloke in a suit. In 2007, British debt was at 844.2 billion, which was just 35.5% of the British GDP. By 2010, it was now 1,433 billion. 60% of our GDP. How many condoms are we sending to Gaza? Well, you see, this debt didn't come from nowhere, right? It all came from a little-known thing called the financial crisis.
A crisis in the US housing market balloons into thousands of job losses in the European property and banking sector.
Now, for many people my age, the financial crisis was like this sort of distant fog in our childhood memory. Something my dad was probably trying to tell me about, but I couldn't hear him over the fans, trying to prevent my computer from overheating whilst I was picking flax in RuneScape. But you see, this moment, little did we know, would go on to define my entire generation's lives. So for us to truly understand what happened on that day, what was the financial crisis, we need to go way back and rewind to the moment where we fundamentally changed how money worked.
The strength of a nation's currency is based on the strength of that nation's economy.
In 1971, there was a man called Richard Nixon, or Ricky Nicky, as his mates would call him. He ended what was called the Bretton Woods system. This was a global financial order where the US dollar was the world's currency. And this dollar, the US dollar, was tied to gold, the gold standard, whereby $35 would get you 1 ounce of gold. It would always get you that amount. This fixed price, this fixed system, was in order to guarantee financial stability. The hope was to prevent another Great Depression and World War II, because, you know, they were pretty bad for business. And so this system had been going for a while, but by the 60s, the dollar was starting to lose value. And that's because America had the genius idea of going to Vietnam and trying to beat communism out of the Vietnamese. So they were spaffing a shitload of money on that, and they were also spending money at home on their welfare programs. This is a scenario that is often referred to as guns and butter, which is where you overheat your economy by funding war, guns, and welfare, butter, both at the same time. And it makes sense, right? Because if you're going to spend all this amount more on war, you need to print more money. And if you print more money, then that money becomes less valuable. And whilst America was nobly beating communism out of the Vietnamese, countries around the world started to notice that the supposedly stable dollar was losing value. And so they hopped on the phone, they jumped on and they said, oh, it's not good, is it? Hello, Mr. Nixon. Yes, we were wondering, can we get our gold back for these dollars? Yes. Yes. You know what, give me to the end of the week. I get paid Friday. Shit. In August of 1971, Nixon said fuck it, and he cut the dollar loose from gold. He ended the Bretton Woods system.
Accordingly, I have directed the Secretary of the Treasury to take the action necessary to defend the dollar against the speculators. I have directed Secretary Connally to suspend temporarily the convertibility of the dollar into gold or other reserve assets, except in amounts and conditions determined to be in the interest of monetary stability and in the best interest of the United States.
And so the handcuffs of government bureaucracy were off. Now, a dollar was just worth a dollar, a piece of paper. It's a really nice looking piece of paper, but nonetheless a piece of paper. And the dollar was no longer tied to anything real. It was just vibes and belief. Now this thing, it was called the Nixon shock. This helped accelerate the many crises of the 70s. Inflation skyrocketed, wages fell. But you see, there was one group of people rubbing their hands together, and that was the bankers. For them, this was game time. By the 80s, Thatcher and Reagan come in with their brand new ideas. Free markets, deregulation, financialization. Oh yeah, and loads of cuts to social welfare spending. Just ignore that bit. And this was all under this kind of narrative of like cutting government bureaucracy, the inefficient, wasteful spending of government bureaucrats. Doesn't that sound familiar? This ideology is known as neoliberalism.
And you're all noble warriors in perhaps our most crucial battle these past 8 years. The battle to reduce the growth and increase the efficiency of the federal government.
Before we go any further, I always get DMs from you guys asking how is it I make these videos. And I'll be totally honest, I wish that when I started, I had today's video sponsor, InVideo AI. InVideo AI is your creative partner, right? It's your right-hand man. You can put your video idea or your script into the AI, and it will generate an entire video from you, either from generative AI or stock video footage, and it will do it in minutes. Why this is helpful is because when you're making a video, it's kind of just a concept in your head. You won't know if it's actually a good video until you come to edit in it, and sometimes it might not be as good as you thought it was. InVideo AI allows you to put a prompt into the AI and literally see what your video is going to look like.
The future of prison reform could be straight out of a sci-fi movie. We could be looking at personalized AI-driven reform programs.
I've been using it to try and see if the pacing of the script is good. If there's bits that are a bit boring and I can cut out, I find it much easier to see it in front of me rather than just know it from reading the script. So basically, InVideo AI is putting you in like the director's seat and creating a visual storyboard that will massively help you before you even have to pick up a camera. You can literally bang your whole script into the AI. As well, you can put in music and manually tweak it with the prompts. You can basically edit any part that you want, like add my voice. And also you can get it to help with the writing. Perhaps you want to engage a certain type of audience and it can cater your script to that audience. Really, InVideo AI is an amazing tool for people who really want to get into content creation. And it can really give you confidence in your video ideas before you go and invest into filming them. So check the links below. You can try InVideo AI for free. And it will save you hundreds and hundreds of dollars on test shoots and filming and editing, etc. Anyway, back to the video. And you see, whilst this was all ironically being sold as like a way for governments to be more fiscally conservative and spend less, government debt continued to rise because they needed to borrow in order to allow for major tax cuts to the rich. This period of time was also a major change for banks. For decades, banks had rules. You know, like the banks weren't allowed to just give all of your life savings to some guy in Varrock Bank telling you he can double your money. There were things in place to like keep the bankers in check from doing stupid shit. But by the 90s, the politicians of that era just said, boring. And so they went through the rule book, right? They were flicking through the pages and just ripping out bits they didn't want, adding in some bits they did want. 1994 in America, you get the Interstate Banking Act, which allowed different banks to merge into one big national bank. In 2000, you get the Commodities Futures Modernization Act. And in 1999, the most important of all of these, the repeal of Glass-Steagall.
It is true that the Glass-Steagall law is no longer appropriate to the economy in which we lived. It worked pretty well for the industrial economy, which was highly organized, much more centralized, and much more nationalized than the one in which we operate today. But the world is very different.
This was a law that made sure that investment banks and regular banks, where people just kept their money, were separate. This was done since the Great Depression to stop another Great Depression. But they got rid of it, and now the banks were free to fucking YOLO your life savings on Dogecoin. And so in this one decade in the 90s, whilst we're all fucking playing Pokemon and listening to Nirvana, the bankers had done a silent coup on the governments of the Western world. The rules were gone. We deregulated, and now they were free. And the economy started to boom. But you see, this boom and this economy, there was a problem because, well, this was an economy and a boom that was built on very sandy foundations. And, of course, it wouldn't last forever.
Early this morning, the stock market leapt up. It's steadied now, and there's now a rumour that interest rates might come down. So the champagne is flowing as the city's young brokers and commodity dealers raise many and many a glass to the prospect of making lots more money.
So you see, during this neoliberal small state / the government revolution, which was really good, it was a really good time, it's great. Well, you see, due to the fact that they were cutting welfare spending and reducing workers' unions, workers' rights, by the 2000s, wage growth had started to really stagnate. And with the explosion of the dot-com bubble and other things, the wealthiest of society were getting richer and richer. And so wealth inequality really grew. And the government, who realized that if people keep getting poorer as inflation grows and costs rise, that's probably not a good thing, they decided to do something about that. George Bush announces the Ownership Society. And in the UK, Tony Blair does a very similar thing. The idea here was that they looked around, they said, well, you know, if the poor are getting poorer, what if instead of supporting them, we treat them all like they're mini capitalists, owning a portfolio of assets and creating wealth? And that means we can cut state support more. And like, what better way is there for the ordinary person to build wealth other than housing? Right? Right? So these governments, they rang up the banks and they said, lads, need you to do us a fave. Can you start fucking handing out some more mortgages? You lot have been a little bit stingy lately. Give out more mortgages. And so the banks did that. They started handing out more mortgages to people who probably couldn't afford a mortgage. And these mortgages were known as subprime mortgages. The whole theory of getting everyone to buy a house was to build more wealth for ordinary people. However, in reality, what was happening was ordinary people weren't really getting richer. They were just getting into lots of debt. You see, the UK's debt to income ratio had been pretty stable during the 90s. It was about 1.06. But by 2004, it had skyrocketed to 1.5. And that was because of very slow wage growth. People were being forced to increasingly rely on debt in order to keep up with the rising cost of living. And because banks had deliberately coerced people into thinking they could afford a home when they couldn't. And the way they did this was by creating a very clever scheme. By offering to these people what were called adjustable rate mortgages, or ARMs. These were mortgages, right, that had very low payments at first that people could afford. But after a while, there'd be massive increases in these payments. It would get really expensive. However, my friends, do not worry, for we have created an infinite money glitch. Because the house that you're purchasing will continue to grow in value, and trust us, they will. There's no way they can stop growing in value. What you can do before the increased payments is you can just refinance your mortgage. By that point, your home will be much more valuable, and the banks will give you a new loan with much better terms. And all this genius scheme needed to work was for house prices to continue rising forever. But what if they didn't do that? You see, by the 2000s, inflation was creeping up. Thanks to the American-led Iraq War, oil prices were skyrocketing. Oil went from $20 a barrel in 2002 to $140 a barrel by 2008. Oil price increases have effect on everything: transport costs, energy costs, Pokemon card costs. And so as government spending was continuing to rise because of this war, it was looking more and more like Vietnam. Guns and butter all over again. Central banks, when they were seeing this creeping inflation, decided they needed to do something. Between 2004 and 2006, the US Federal Reserve jacked up interest rates from 1% to 5.25%. And this would be the first domino to fall. The rise in interest rates had a massive effect on homeowners. Millions of homeowners now had a problem. Because around about the same sort of time, as so many people had been motivated to get on the housing ladder, the demand for housing started to dry up. I mean, if we look at the charts, UK had a home ownership rate of about 70%. And so, the demand for housing had dropped, meaning house prices had stopped rising. And, along with this sudden rise in interest rates, the fucking infinite money glitch had been patched.
We had the greatest asset bubble in history, and now that bubble is bursting. The single biggest piece of the bubble is the US mortgage market, and we're probably about halfway through the unwinding and bursting of that bubble.
And so people just started to default on their loans en masse. And like, yeah, people being made homeless, that sucks, but what if the banks, the bankers, what if accidentally they had taken all these subprime mortgages they were offering to other investors as a safe asset, guaranteed money. And what if accidentally every bank and investment firm, what if they had also bought all of that debt from the subprime mortgages? That would probably suck even more. Left, right and centre, the banks just started collapsing, one after the other. And by October 2008, we're in a complete global financial meltdown. Stock markets crash, no one wants to lend any money out, and so businesses started to collapse as well. The entire economy was in freefall. And so, the governments had one big question. What the fuck do we do now? 2008 should have been a period of time where we realized that neoliberalism, this ideology which was ignited by Nixon, exploded under Thatcher and Reagan, and then accelerated under Blair and Bush, had led to this zombified mantra of deregulation, selling off of state assets to private individuals, and massively cutting welfare spending. It should have been obvious that that ideology had failed. It came to its logical conclusion. A deregulated bank being allowed to do something incredibly dodgy, causing everyone to lose all of their money. And at that moment, we had an opportunity to put our country on a different path, a much more stable and much less risky one. And so, on June 22nd, 2010, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, George Osborne, under David Cameron's Conservative Party, got up in front of a podium to address the nation.
If we don't get on top of our debt, every family in Britain will be poorer, and the dreams of millions of young people will be dashed.
There will be overall savings in fundings to councils of 7.1% a year for 4 years. We've made sure we're all in this together, and we've taken our country back from the brink of bankruptcy. A stronger Britain starts here, and I commend this statement to that.
I think today's announcement is absolutely devastating for communities up and down the country. What George Osborne has said today, for example, is that we're going to see 500,000 people in the public sector put out of work. That will have a knock-on effect in the private sector, so that could be a budget essentially for destroying 1 million jobs.
So the UK and the United States bailed out the banks to the tune of £500 billion, with a guarantee of £1 trillion. That is taxpayer money, our money, paying to keep banks alive. Also known as socialism for the rich. And so to cover this inordinate spending, this incredible amount of debt we had to take, you might be wondering, how did we cover that cost? Surely we must have taxed the very rich because they have all the money. And surely we must have punished the banks, right? Make them pay for all this mess. Nah, that isn't what we did. Instead, we launched our very own Doge department. Or as we call it, austerity. Austerity was being euphemistically sold to us as fixing the roof while the sun was still shining.
Having come this far, there can be no turning back. We should aim for a new settlement across the political spectrum where it is accepted that without sound public finances, there is no economic security for working people. That those who suffer when governments run unsustainable deficits are not the richest, but the poorest. And therefore, in normal economic times, governments should run an overall budget surplus, so our country is better prepared for whatever storms lie ahead. In short, we should always fix the roof while the sun is shining.
Which is political jargon for massive cuts to public services, benefits and wages for ordinary people, and massive taxpayer bailouts for billionaires.
Are the cuts going to hurt, Chancellor?
No public servant in Britain will escape the pain of the cuts. 500,000 of them are set to lose their jobs in the police force, in prisons, defence, education and foreign affairs. Faced with the biggest budget deficit in Europe, the government insists it had no choice.
So the people whose lives had been ruined by the financial crash, they were being punished. It was their services that were being taken from them. And the people who caused the crisis, they were being bailed out, continuing to make tons of money, the bankers getting bonuses, and they got off with little to no legal time, no prison time. So how did our Doge department fare? From 2010 onwards, the Doge department, aka austerity, gutted public spending, with £500 billion worth of planned public spending cut over a decade. If we go through some of the cuts, man, it's pretty bad. Welfare and benefits were cut by 30 billion. Disability benefits were slashed by 10%, which was about £1,500 per disabled person who was claiming it. Universal credit was introduced to try and make it even harder for people to make a claim for benefits. Housing was cut by 60%. So our social housing in this period of time was being sold off to people and they weren't rebuilding them to replace the stock. Between 2010 and 2016, homelessness doubled, with rough sleeping up by 165% by 2020. Local governments, their budgets were cut by 40%. 500 plus libraries were shut, 600 youth centres were closed. Social care budgets were cut by 7.7 billion. 7 billion was cut from schools, so per pupil funding went down by 9%. University tuition fees tripled to £9,000 a year, just saddling a whole generation of students into debt. Public sector pay was frozen, which means with inflation, 10% of real wages were lost. VAT was raised by 20%, which hits the poorest people the hardest. 600 million was cut from mental health funding. And because this all has impact on people's health, an increased demand in the NHS led to a 100,000 person staff shortage, as the waiting list soared to 4.5 million. And the thing is, right, when the government launched austerity, the logic, the thinking behind it was very simple. We've spent too much money, we need to cut back, and once we get our deficit under control, the economy will recover. The idea was that by cutting government spending, our debt would shrink. This would bring confidence into the British economy and businesses would come in and invest. And that all sounds very logical, right? Well, there was one gigantic problem.
And very clearly the answer that emerges, you don't, in most episodes in which debt was significantly reduced, it is not through growth. It has involved painful restructurings in fiscal policy.
A lot of the justification that came for austerity came from a 2010 paper by Carmen Reinhart and Kenneth Rogoff. These were two Harvard economists. They did this study and they came to the conclusion that when a country's debt to GDP ratio exceeds 90%, economic growth slows drastically. High debt equals low growth. This paper was fucking cited everywhere. This was like the fucking Bible of austerity. However, there was one very small problem, and that was that a few years later, in 2013, a group of researchers fact-checked this paper and discovered that they had made an error in the Excel spreadsheet.
America's most prominent economists are talking about an embarrassing mistake with big implications.
The mistake was hidden inside the calculations of some enormously influential research that recommended painful austerity measures to help weak economies recover.
In 2013, I wrote a paper critiquing the Reinhardt-Rogoff study that found that high levels of debt cause slow growth, and that when the debt-to-GDP ratio passed beyond 90%, that essentially we were in the danger zone where the chance of slow growth really increased. I found a series of 3 problems with their analysis.
The fucking maths was wrong. The maths that was used to justify massive spending cuts, slashes to public services, freezing of wages, gutting welfare, all happened because of a fucking spreadsheet mistake. What they did was they miscalculated. It would be funny if this wasn't so tragic. What they did was they miscalculated GDP growth for high debt countries. When the data was corrected, this supposed high debt growth collapse thing didn't actually exist. The paper said that countries with 90% debt ratios see their economy shrink by 0.1%. Instead, it should have found that they grow by 2.2%, less than that of lower debt ratios, but not a spiraling collapse. Countries with high debt can still grow. There was no fucking magic 90% growth collapse thing. So the entire theory of austerity was built on incorrect maths. But by the time that was revealed, it was too late. The damage had been done and the dogma had been set in.
I'm the Chancellor, dealing with the problems I inherited from the last government, but confronting those problems head on. And everything I do is to get the British economy moving forward, creating jobs and overcoming those deep-seated problems built up over many years.
So the government cut all this public spending, expecting that the private sector would step in and grow the economy. But instead of that happening, here's what really happened. Cutting public sector jobs and welfare benefits meant that fewer people had money to spend in the economy. If you consider that 17.3% of our workforce work in the public sector, then those cuts have a massive effect on a lot of people. So when people have less extra money to spend every month, they stop buying things. If they were planning to renovate the house, then they're not going to do that. If they used to eat out in restaurants every other week and now they don't have the money to do that, they stopped spending on luxuries. This led to a fall in demand for businesses. And so businesses invested less because, well, no one's spending. So what's the point of putting more money in if they're not going to spend it? And this led to Britain's economic growth slowing down. So the central banks, right, they're seeing that the economy is stalling and they decide to slash interest rates to near zero. This means that if big businesses want to borrow lots of money, they can do so basically for free. The logic here being, if money is free to borrow, then these rich people will borrow it and invest it into growing their business. And people, they borrowed the money, but they just didn't spend it in the way that the policymakers thought they were going to. Instead of investing in new industries, new factories, new jobs, wealthy individuals, investment firms and banks used this free money to buy up existing assets. Housing and real estate became one of the main targets. Firms like Blackstone bought up entire neighborhoods, whilst the banks who controlled the mortgage market, banks in which ultra-wealthy people were invested in, were profiting from the interest payments that ordinary people were paying on their mortgages. And so as more houses were becoming investment opportunities, like how when more people buy into Bitcoin, the prices go up, this meant for the ordinary people that were getting poorer, more and more people were being pushed into renting, and because the property values started to go up, it meant that their rent prices went up. All of this increasing the demand for housing. All whilst cuts to social housing meant that the government weren't building more social houses. And in the same time, we'd see stock prices soaring because instead of funding risky innovations or new companies and new investments, it was a much safer bet for firms to basically buy up stocks of things that already existed, just dumping their money into the stock market. As well, corporations were doing a thing called stock buybacks, where they would buy up their own stock to reduce the supply of the stocks, artificially inflating the price and making their CEOs much richer, but doing very little to actually grow the economy. So what I'm getting at is that instead of all this money leading to people creating new businesses, new cool ideas and stuff like that, because people didn't have money to spend, firms would mostly borrow very cheap money to buy up existing businesses. They would take them and then cut costs, squeeze every penny they could out them, and it would lead to many of these once successful businesses collapsing. We can see this very evidently with Philip Green and the way he asset stripped the entire British high street, taking a shitload of money and bankrupting him.
It's been confirmed that more than 13,000 jobs are at risk
at the retail empire Arcadia, which includes Topshop, Burton and Dorothy Perkins, which has gone into administration this evening.
And like, whilst this is all happening, right, meanwhile, we're also seeing what was left of our public services being just absolutely destroyed, as the government were relying on these private companies more and more to manage their public services. In a hope to try and cut costs, they were just selling off public services to private companies, and we were doing this for everything, from NHS contracts, to benefit assessments, to private prisons, and even our refugee system is privatized. And these companies don't improve these services, they just cut them, squeeze them for profits. And like, even when it comes to building affordable houses, which the government should have been doing, instead of putting money into building the new social houses that we would have control over, the government instead thought it'd be smarter to just give people housing benefits, which they then go and spend on a private landlord who takes that money. What I'm trying to get out with all this stuff is that this wasn't like sustainable, real economic growth. This was wealth extraction from the ordinary people and the state into the hands of the ultra wealthy. And so our whole economy, everything, our public services, everything just got shitter and shitter, but more expensive. The economy was not growing. It was just being squeezed for every last penny it had. You know what is the biggest irony of all this, right? The Doge department, or austerity, it didn't even fucking work. It didn't save us any money. After a decade of cuts, what do you think we got? Did we lower the deficit? No. Did we get a stronger economy? Obviously not. Did we lower the debt? Not even fucking close, man. Our debt doubled. In 2010, the UK government debt stood at 1 trillion. After a decade of cuts and belt tightening, by 2020, our debt hit 2.1 trillion. We cut everything, we made millions suffer, and we still ended up in deeper debt than before. So you might be wondering, how the fuck does that happen? How? Ultimately, it's a very simple answer, and that is that cutting money shrunk our economy. When people had less money to spend, businesses had less demand and there was less growth. And as we cut all of these public services and they got worse and worse, it forces the government to have to spend more money. It's like one of those fucking squeezy toys that, you know, you squeeze the belly and the head inflates. When you cut funding to public services, you just push the cost to another area. When you cut social care, you will have a ripple effect on public health. It's completely linked, right? More people in poverty, the worse their health. And when people are in worse health, they have to use the NHS more. And if their health gets so bad, you will force more people to have to take disability benefits because their health might stop them from working. If you cut policing and building enough prisons, etc., this leads to rising crime. When you have rising crime, you have more prisoners and you have to pay more money to house those prisoners in the prison. When you cut funding to local councils, that means that the infrastructure, the schools, the roads, they get shitter and shitter, and one day you need to repair that infrastructure, those buildings, the potholes in the roads. And it becomes more and more expensive to fix the longer you leave it. And it also just has other effects that you don't even think about. Like, because of the central government stopping giving so much money to the local councils, that council still has to find that money to afford things like, I don't know, taking out the bins and stuff like that, cutting the grass, cleaning the town centre. And they have to find that money somewhere. So in turn, what a lot of them did was jack up business rates for businesses that operate in that town. And so if I want to go set up a little coffee shop or something like that, it's now more expensive for me. Harder for me to make profit, harder for me to employ people. Also, the local councils would jack up things like fines, parking tickets. All of this just results in like a decaying high street that we see around so many parts of the UK. And just with all the fines and the penalties, etc., just creates this feeling of like, I don't know, like the fucking country is just permanently out to get you. So I think you're starting to see why it causes low growth, right? And low growth means low wage growth, which again means more people have to go on benefits. 38% of benefit claimants in this country are in work. Our Doge department didn't save us any money. As our GDP growth stalled, so too did our tax revenues, which meant, ironically, that Britain had to borrow more money. We needed more debt just to keep the ship afloat. But, you know, that's in the past, right? Thank God, you know, it's so long ago. We finally got through it, right? You know, it'd be a real shame if some massive crisis was about... Oh, shit.
The first death from coronavirus here in the United States.
The World Health Organization has officially called it COVID-19.
I urge you, at this moment of national emergency, to stay at home, protect our NHS, and save lives.
COVID was really the fucking straw that broke the camel's back for Britain. It hit at exactly the wrong time. Like, by 2020, most of the other governments around the world realized that austerity doesn't work, and many of them had started to reinvest into public spending and like investment into infrastructure, etc. But here in Britain, we thought, nah, fuck that. We don't need it. We just need to hold on a little bit longer. 14 years of Conservatives in charge meant that austerity never actually truly ended. We just kept rebranding it. Every few years, it would get a new little label, fresh coat of paint, and then send them back out. So when COVID hit, our economy was already fucking weak, and we just weren't ready to deal with a pandemic. And then we got hit with that double whammy when Russia invaded Ukraine. Energy prices skyrocketed, inflation spiraled out of control, living costs exploded, while wages, somehow that one didn't rise. That just remained stagnant. And all in all, it was just too much for Britain to handle. Right now, in this country, we have 30% of our children in poverty. Many, many more people are needing to use food banks, and 1 in 5 of them are in work. And because people have no disposable income, new businesses are struggling. And it's left Britain trapped in this kind of like, this doom loop. Now, like, it might sound to you like it's really fucking obvious how we fix this mess. The UK desperately needs to start investing in its infrastructure and spend more. We need to fund things properly so that we can make an economy that one day will be productive again. However, investment takes time, right? It could be 5, 10 years before you see real good signs of growth. And because our politicians are absolutely useless, completely self-interested, and literally do not give a single shit about you, we're in this like political stalemate where no one can just say what needs to be said. Labour will sit there and say, look how bad our public services have got after 14 years of cuts. The Conservatives and Reform will tell us that, oh no, it's not the cuts, it's because of government bureaucracy. And the worst part is that they're both kind of correct. Britain doesn't really have big government or free markets, really. Our private railways still need massive government assistance to keep them alive, and they're barely alive because they're in massive debt. Our publicly funded NHS relies on private contractors who just leech money out of it. Our public services were gutted by austerity but are expected to operate like a really well-functioning business. Because of the cuts, we don't have efficient public services, nor do we have a very dynamic private sector. We just have what you could call corporate welfare, whereby our government bureaucrats just funnels our money into the hands of private companies while blaming itself for its own failure. And every single fucking time our system has collapsed under its own contradictions, the ultra wealthy always seem to have this one exact same argument, this one reason why it keeps happening. You know what the problem is? Too much government. We need to be more efficient. We need to think like a business. We need to make more cuts. Or as Elon Musk and Donald Trump say with their Doge department, we must get rid of waste, fraud, and abuse. If we want to cut waste, we can start with the billions of taxpayer money that's handed over to Serco, Capita, and Atos, who we pay to deliver our public service. If we want to cut fraud, why did Rishi Sunak write off £4 billion worth of COVID fraud? If we want to cut abuse, what about, like, I don't know, maybe the energy companies who are making record profits while people can't afford to heat their own homes? This right here, this whole repetitive narrative, this is the big scam. It's the same trick they do every time. They cut funding to public services, and when those public services go to shit because they don't have enough money, they use this as evidence that the government can't do anything. The government does everything wrong, whilst very quietly they sell off the scraps to their private billionaire friends. And every single time in history where their ideology has failed, they never learn from it. They never abandoned it. They just rebrand it every single time. In the 1980s, Margaret Thatcher and Reagan were telling us that the free markets will save us. In the 1990s, Clinton and Blair, they were talking about the third way, that free markets are your friend. In the 2010s, Cameron and Osborne, they were telling us that we need to fix the roof whilst the sun's shining. And in the 2020s, you have Elon Musk and the Reform Party talking about government efficiency, cut the waste. Tech billionaires will save us all. But what we need to realize is every single fucking time, it's the same exact scam. The same con again and again. Every decade or so, they come along and shrink the state, all while funneling money upwards to the wealthiest. And when it all implodes, they just blame government spending once again.
By forming Citizens Against Government Waste, a private group with a very public agenda. And Peter, I want you and the Citizens Against Government Waste to hold the beacon high and guide us along the way.
I have discussed with Trump the idea of a government efficiency commission.
Nice.
And that's where we're at right now, right? This is the verge of another rebrand. America have got Doge, and the Reform Party here wants to bring that in. The Tories will always do more cuts, and because Labour have no fucking backbone, they will just do a watered down version of what everyone else does. So it leaves us at a crossroads, right? Do we keep playing the same repetitive game, selling off every single thing that isn't nailed to the fucking ground, and sit back, watch our economy get weaker and weaker as more people fall into poverty? Or do we finally break that cycle? Because if we don't, we all know what will happen. We'll be stood here 10 years time, another geezer with some ridiculous outfit, promising us all that this time, if we just do a few more cuts, make it a little bit more efficient, finally, all of us will be rich together. I promise.
The overall government has to be smaller.
Okay.
You can't. Whoever's
so what do you want to cut in the government?
If you, yeah, well, I mean, you'd have to.
Child services.
We'd have to. No.
Police.
No. Well,
education.
No,
NHS.
All I know is this.
Pensions.
You go to Switzerland, they spend
welfare for single mothers.
25%.
Disabled benefits. What do you want to cut?
Hold up. All I know is in Switzerland.
I'll tell you what I want to do.
The government is 25%.
I want to cut the taxes on those entrepreneurs and raise the taxes on the billionaires.
Yeah.
If you enjoyed that video, jump on my Patreon. You can support the channel. I'll catch you in the next one. Peace. Oh my God, I was tired.